Me through the microphone? Sort of. Okay. I think that's the closest I can get it to myself. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully that microphone will all work out. Thank you all for coming out or coming down on I was going to say on a beautiful Tuesday morning, but it's not a beautiful Tuesday morning. It's just a sort of raw Tuesday morning, but I'm glad you're all here to learn a little bit about Jacobsburg. You probably heard the name Jacobsburg because of the state park or the historical society. As Joe mentioned, Jacobsburg Historical Society is nearby. It manages several properties, including the Pennsylvania Long Rifle Museum, which is in the state park property, and then the J. Joseph Henry House, which is across the street. But neither of those properties, neither the state park nor the properties managed by Jacobsburg Historical Society, strictly speaking, were part of the village of Jacobsburg itself. That village was a small industrial community that stood just north of the Bushkill Creek near the Environmental Education Center, if you know where that is. And it flourished for about 100 years. So let me first show you where we are and where it is. Oh, okay, it's off. Okay, so you can see down at the bottom, we're at Moravian Hall Square in red there. These are the properties managed by the Jacobsburg Historical Society, the Henry Mansion on the downside of Henry Road and the Long Rifle Museum on the state side. But Jacobsburg is further north of that, in the state park, about a mile up the Bushkill Creek. And this village on the hill there, about a mile above Bolton on the Bushkill Creek, it's totally vanished. There were ruins of the village, and members of Jacobsburg Historical Society excavated the foundations of many of the buildings there in the 1970s and early 1980s. Perhaps some of you remember this project. But in the years since these archaeological efforts exposed the ruins of the buildings of Jacobsburg, the landscape has entirely swallowed them up again. So for a little bit this morning, we can try to revive the village of Jacobsburg. I'll introduce you to a couple figures, William Henry from Nazareth, and more centrally, Matthew Henry, his son. But let me start with Jacob Hubler, who was the first settler in that area. He was born in Switzerland in 1711, and he emigrated to America in the late 1730s. And in the 1740s, he began to accumulate a substantial amount of land that by the time of his death in the late 1780s was known as the Jacobsburg Tract, named after him, Jacob Hubler. And this is that tract, which we still call the Jacobsburg Tract. It was surveyed by a Moravian surveyor after his death. And it's easier to see the tract when I highlight its boundaries. Perhaps you can't see, so I'll just tell you that Hubler purchased land, the weird shape of the tract, he purchased land that gave him access to waterways. So you can see the Bushkill Creek is sort of around the bottom, and two other waterways. Sober Creek comes into the Bushkill from the west, and Engler's Creek flows into the Bushkill from the north, and the weird shape of the track follows those waterways. Hubler didn't build much on this property. He didn't lay out a village, like the village of Jacobsburg was not laid out by Hubler. He just built a small dwelling, usually called his cabin, and you can just see it, if you see that red circle, you can just see it on the tract there. And this cabin, Matthew Henry wrote in 1851, about 100 years later, was a small log dwelling house at a spring near the Minnesink Road leading from Nazareth to the Wind Gap. The Minnesink Road was an old Native American path that ran through Nazareth up to the Wind Gap. I think the current Jacobsburg Road follows that path. Again, it's sort of hard to see, but on this Moravian drawn map, the menacing path is here, running from here up through Nazareth, continued north, that dotted line, and just in that circle to the left of the dotted line, it says Hubler. It's the only map that we know of that actually marks where Hubler's cabin was. On the west side of the menacing path, exactly where Matthew Henry 100 years ago said he remembered it being. 100 years later. I'll just mention it because it often comes up that the Hubler cabin on that map was not the spot of the current Henry homestead at Jacobsburg, what's now the Pennsylvania Long Rifle Museum. And Matthew Henry stated that clearly in his history, that Hubler's cabin was no longer standing in 1851, at which time his nephew, James Henry, was living in the Henry homestead. And as you can see from this map, the Henry properties are down south, the lower circle, whereas Jacobsburg is up on that weird oval shape. Again, about a mile up the Bushkill. And records state that sometime in the early 1780s, a few years before his death, I think he died in 1789, Jacob Hubler built a store on his tract of land, on this big Jacobsburg tract. And it was a smart thing to do. That the main value of the land was that through it ran this important path from Nazareth up to the Wind Gap, and from there to the lands sort of north of the Blue Mountains. So it was a good spot for a store and an inn that serviced travelers. So Hubler died in 1789, owning a very large tract of land, which his children sold a few years later. So we saw that strange-shaped tract from the other map, that Moravian survey map, and I've just superimposed it on a modern map with 33 running north, and the park is in green there. There's problems with this, but we'll just believe it for now. So when Hubler's children sold the land, this Jacobsburg tract, a few years after his death, 3 Moravian men from Nazareth bought the land. And within a few years, nearly all of the land that those 3 men bought had passed into the hands of one of the original purchasers, whose name was William Henry. And he also purchased, over the next few years, a lot of adjacent land. So by the mid-1790s, William Henry of Nazareth was the sole proprietor of a very large tract of land. So who was William Henry, and why was he purchasing this vast tract of land? This is him. He was a Moravian who'd grown up in Lancaster and had moved here to Northampton County during the American Revolution to train as a gunsmith. And he had large responsibilities at a gun shop run by the Moravian Church at a place called Christian Spring, which is about 1.5 miles west, maybe 2 miles west of Nazareth. And so he was there during the war from 1776 to 1780, and then in 1780 he moved to Nazareth itself, and he married, and he built a home there on South Main Street, just below the Circle, and he worked as a gunsmith. But by the late 1780s, the Nazareth Moravian congregation needed William Henry to do other things, and primarily to serve as the town's joiner. So sort of also worked with wood, as he would have in making rifles, but also carpentry work, and he also served as an architect for the community. He built Bethlehem's first bridge in 1794, a very talented man. But all this forced him to give up his trade as a gunsmith. And it's in this same period, after he'd given up his trade as a gunsmith, that William Henry starts to buy all of this land north of Nazareth and outside the Moravian community. He didn't purchase the land to build a gun factory on it. In fact, he didn't know that he would ever work again as a gunsmith. We don't really know why he bought the land, but it seems likely that he bought it as sort of a first effort at land speculation, buying valuable land and selling it. It was one of the few ways that a Moravian in Nazareth could get rich. The church there controlled their trades and controlled their economies. You couldn't get rich by being a gunsmith or a tinker or a carpenter, but you could get rich buying land uncontrolled by the Moravian church and selling it. So he probably bought it as a speculation. Now, within that large tract of land that William Henry owned, I added a little red box in the middle, and that was owned by somebody else. It was owned by somebody named Nathaniel Mickler. And the parcel, that little box, that little parcel that Nathaniel Mickler owned, included the store and the inn that Jacob Hubler had built in the 1780s. And in 1798, the federal government taxed buildings directly or property directly, and the tax rolls show that Mickler had a 2-story stone structure there in the middle of William Henry's property. It measured 40 feet by 46 feet. It was the only structure in the entire tract. It was valued at $1,000. And Mickler operated a store and an inn there for about 15 years. By the way, he was William Henry's brother-in-law. No, yes, he was William Henry's brother-in-law. And this little store nestled in the middle of William Henry's property on that road between Nazareth and the Wind Gap was always a family affair for the Henrys. So it was owned by his brother-in-law first, this guy Nathaniel Mickler, and then when Mickler passed on, not passed on, but moved to do something else, the store passed from Mickler to William Henry's children, to his daughter and her husband, Sabina and John Frederick Whalley. We actually, okay. So that's Mickler's store up there on a bigger map. Forgot about that slide. And then when Mickler gave it up, it passed to Henry's children. That's his daughter. It's amazing we have photographs of these people. But that's William Henry's daughter, Sabina Henry. That's her husband, John Frederick Whalley, and they ran the store. So it was still a family affair with William Henry. And the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem has some incredible material from this store. Including an 1810 inventory that gives us a pretty good sense of what William Henry's children were selling there. Fabrics, clothing from shawls to caps to gloves, stationery, pencils and quills, but also dictionaries and Bibles. They were selling tinware, from kettles and coffee pots to canisters. They were selling crockery, sugar bowls to chamber pots, drugs, tobacco, tubs for butter, barrels for molasses, all sorts of iron goods, watch chains and wire, and combs and knives and shoe buckles. And then they sold groceries, butter and raisins and coffee and all sorts of liquor. So it was quite a store here in the middle of the Jacobsburg tract. And over the year, that shop and little tavern expanded. On the left, you can see what it looked like in 1862. I'm getting ahead of the story, but since we're talking about the store, that's what it looked like on the left in 1862. The Henry family had a big reunion there. It was called the Jacobsburg Hotel at that point. And the image on the right, where it's in ruins, I think is from 1920. So to sum up, so far, from the heirs of Jacob Hubler, the first settler on the tract, William Henry of Nazareth purchased a really large tract of land that was undeveloped or unimproved. There were no buildings on it. It was forest, except for a tiny parcel within the tract owned by someone else, which had a store and an inn or tavern, and it was operated initially by his brother-in-law and then by his daughter and son-in-law. So the first improvement on the Jacobsburg tract, besides the store and tavern, was a gun factory that William Henry, the gentleman I talked to you about before, built in 1798. Remember, he buys the land in 1790 and 92. So as I mentioned earlier, he wasn't working as a gunsmith in Nazareth in the 1790s. The community had forced him to undertake a different trade. And he kept asking for permission to return to the gunsmith's trade, and the community kept rejecting his requests. But in 1798, he'd sort of had enough, and he secured a large government contract to produce muskets. He only had a little shop in downtown Nazareth that he was using as his joiner shop, and Moravian authorities wouldn't allow him to enlarge his small home there on Main Street, South Main Street, into a larger gun factory. And so William Henry, that was his first plan, but when they did not give him permission, he decided to build a gun factory on this land that he'd purchased almost a decade before, and that was still unimproved, nothing was on it, on the Jacobsburg tract. And Henry wrote about this many years later. He said, in the years 98, that's 1798, to 1802 to 3, I was engaged in furnishing 2,000 stand of muskets for the use of the state of Pennsylvania, made after a pattern given by the state. I commenced by erecting a considerable building on the Bushkill Creek for grinding and boring of barrels and polishing, so that was his gun factory, and also smith shops and file shops, which were finished in the spring of 99. So he was very clear. He built it from 1798 to 1799. And this little industrial complex, as Henry said, there was a gunworks there along with smith shops and filing shops. It operated for only about 5 years. Need to jump ahead 2 slides here. In 1803, as this advertisement in an Easton paper shows, he tried to sell his Jacobsburg property, including the considerable building, as he called it, that was the gun factory, in 1803. He described his properties in this advertisement. The paper was called the American Eagle. Situated on the Bushkill Creek, the mill is erected near the road and may be made into a grist mill with a trifling expense. The building had those properties. But the properties didn't sell, and Henry himself, as he wrote later, after my contracts were completed, the said into a grist mill, which has had sufficient gunworks into a mill, a grist mill. Structure looked like. I think it. Okay.
So it just moves slightly.
I heard yeses and nos. How about now? And for the rest of this talk. Okay. To turn my head every now and then. Yeah, we have no idea what the structure looked like. How about if I just yell? The other mic, the mic you were carrying.
See if I can, excuse me, man.
Yeah.
Seems like it wasn't on there. Hold on a second.
Oh, maybe that's it.
This is going off, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Let's try this one. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Something is rustling. Hold on. It's this one that's rustling, isn't it? Testing, testing.
You don't think the handheld?
Let's go to that. Option for recording. Testing, testing. No. Okay. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. You have to hold it pretty.
Yeah. Okay, so you can hear me? Okay.
Someone shout out if I, take this away from my mouth. Okay, so where we were is there's that store. That's the star to the left. William Henry has built his gun factory. That's the star below the Bushkill Creek. And after 5 years of operating as a gun factory, he finished his contract with the state and he converted it into a grist mill. And the point I was about to make is that we don't really know what that building looked like. Either when it was a gun factory between 1798 and 1803, or afterwards when it operated as a grist mill and also a sawmill. There's been various imaginative reconstructions. In the middle is the colored one, is from a state park flyer very early on in the life of that state park. The two on either side were drawn by a man named Dale Prinky. You'll notice at different times he drew it in different ways, but no description of this factory and no image of it survives from the period when it operated or from years afterwards. But Virginia and Joseph Lopresti, who were archaeologists working with Jacobsburg Historical Society, founders of the society, excavated many of the foundations at this village of Jacobsburg in the 70s and 80s, and they were able to establish the gun factory's precise location because they excavated the mill that it had become, the grist mill. And so they established its location south of the Bushkill Creek in the summer of 1979. So we know exactly where William Henry's gun factory was because it was excavated many years later after it had become a mill. And a few years after Henry built this gun factory, and it had been converted into a grist mill, a country mill, as he said, he built something else. He built a forge lower down on the Bushkill, a forge with one hammer and two fires, he said, about a quarter of a mile below the mill. And this forge produced its first bar iron in March of 1809. Now in 1812, Matthew Henry, who will be the star of the rest of our talk, Matthew Henry, one of William Henry's sons, returned to Nazareth from Lidditz in Lancaster County. He'd been apprenticed to a shopkeeper there, and he was shifting his career. So he comes back to Northampton County. He rents his father's forge and the mill that had grown out of the gun factory, and then he purchased these operations from his father a few years later in 1815. And this is really the turning point or the main milestone in the history of the area because it's Matthew Henry who would build what would become the village of Jacobsburg on the steep hill above these industrial operations he purchased from his father. So you can see in that oval, which is a hill, where Matthew Henry would build subsequent structures. He was only 25 years old. And he wasn't alone up there. Remember, his sister and brother-in-law were running the store. That's Matthew. But he is the central figure in the rest of the story of the rise and the fall of the village of Jacobsburg. So he's there renting his father's properties, which he then builds. In 1819, a few years after he settled at Jacobsburg to run the industries, he got married to his cousin from Lancaster, named Anne Catherine Henry. These last two paintings I've shown you were just donated from the family to Jacobsburg about a year and a half ago. They'd been in the family for close to 200 years. So it's Matthew Henry who built the village of Jacobsburg on that hill above the Bushkill. And the first thing he did, or one thing he did, I guess we don't really know the order he did it in, but the first thing he did was he built a home and an office at the top of the hill. That's the home. We have these photos because his descendants, Matthew Henry's descendants, had a family reunion in 1902 at the home. And Caroline Henry, Matthew and Catherine's first child, born 82 years earlier in 1820, returned to Jacobsburg for that reunion. You can't see her, but she's here in the photo. And from these photos, we also know that the home was built into the hill So if you looked at it from the front, pictured there on the left, it looks like a one-story home that's facing north. But if you were down the hill looking up, it looked like a full two-story home. And at their 1902 reunion, the Henrys also photographed the office, Matthew Henry's stone office, that was closely adjacent to the home. You can sort of see it in the photo on the left there. And the Loprestis, these archaeologists, members of Jacobsburg Historical Society, confirmed the location of these buildings because they excavated the office right near Matthew Henry's home. That's a picture of their excavation. Now, lower down on that hill, Matthew Henry built a furnace. And this was going to be the big money maker at Jacobsburg. He built the furnace in 1824, and it yielded its first pig iron and stove castings in 1825. And he named the furnace that he built Catherine Furnace, after his wife, Anne Catherine. And a few stove plates that say Catherine Furnace on them survive. We have one at Jacobsburg, and there's one at the Moravian Historical Society here in Nazareth, a few blocks away from us. We don't have any images of the furnace itself, of Catherine Furnace. So this image is a imaginative reconstruction. This tall thing here is the furnace. Up at the top of the slide is a charcoal shed that would have held the charcoal for the furnace, and connecting them is a long track that would have been used to deliver the charcoal from the shed down to the furnace. Again, this is all built on a hill. The Loprestis excavated this site. The furnace seems to have been turned into a tannery, or at least a tannery was built on the side of the furnace. So what they excavated was the tannery, but that seems to be the site of where the furnace was. It was built upon the spot, Matthew Henry said, of Catherine Furnace. So let's pause a minute, take stock of Jacobsburg, say, in 1830, because things are going to go downhill in a minute. Matthew Henry's industrial activities have precipitated a small village there at Jacobsburg, and he seemed to be thriving with a grist mill, a forge, and a furnace. There was a thriving store and hotel close by. And just down the Bushkill Creek was his older brother, Joseph Henry, operating the Bolton Gun Works, down where Jacobsburg Historical Society has its properties today. So you can see at the very bottom, down the Bushkill Creek, was the gun factory called Bolton. And Joseph Henry's family, his descendants at Bolton, remained on that property for another 150 years, until 1989, when Mary Henry Stites passed away at Bolton. It seems likely that Matthew Henry was expecting the same kind of long life at Jacobsburg. He probably felt very settled into that village that he had built. And he and his wife, Anne Catherine Henry, after whom he'd named his furnace, had quite a few children by 1830. Everything seemed promising. But in 1833, so just a couple years after the moment that I paused there, Anne Catherine Henry died. She was 39 years old. She'd been married to Matthew Henry for 13 years, and they had had 10 children. 6 of them had survived at the time of Anne Catherine Henry's death. I don't mention this later in the talk, so I'll just tell you, Matthew Henry remarried, I do mention that, and had 7 more children. So 17 children with 2 wives. But when Anne Catherine Henry dies, there are 6 children in the family. And her death is mentioned in a March 1833 letter from Joseph Berg to his sister Esther Berg, who were friends with Matthew and Anne Catherine Henry. And here's what Joseph Berg wrote to his sister to describe the sad news from Jacobsburg. "What do you say to poor Mrs. Henry's death? She suffered very much during the last weeks of her life. I pity her poor children and her husband. She was an excellent woman, and I feel very sorry that she is no more. I suppose Mr. Henry will probably be obliged to seek another helpmate shortly. I don't see what other alternative remains." The issue, as you can guess, that left Matthew Henry obliged to seek another wife was that, as I mentioned, 6 children survived their mother, Anne Catherine Henry. So who would take care of this large household? And maybe in the passage that I just read, Joseph Berg was subtly trying to put the idea in his sister's head that she could become Matthew Henry's next wife, or maybe he thought that idea was already in her head. But pretty soon, the brother and sister are discussing the possibility openly. Sometime in early May, 1833, she passed away in February, sometime in early May, Matthew Henry proposed by letter to Esther Berg. She had reservations. Having just turned 23 years old, she was worried about being responsible for 6 children who ranged in age from 2 to 13. And she discussed her reservations with her brother, Joseph, who was, however, a very strong advocate for Mr. Henry, as he called Matthew. Berg wrote that, the brother, "A better and more honorable man does not exist within the circle of my acquaintance." In this May 16th letter, Joseph Berg wrote, "I can see nothing which could prevent you from closing with Mr. Henry's offer." Sounds like a business deal. "I'm in favor of your acceptance of his offer, provided you believe you can love him." And the brother, Joseph, listed many great advantages, which included, you will be comfortably settled for life, and you may perhaps have the opportunity of improving our good mother's condition. Their mother, the widow, Berg, was living in Bethlehem in constrained circumstances. Joseph seemed to think that Matthew Henry was prosperous and would only prosper more in the future. That's the import of his arguments to his sister. And Joseph assured his sister that he believed her quite capable of performing the new duties that will be assigned to you, far more arduous, he wrote, than any which have as yet been allotted to you. Esther, the sister, understandably remained worried, and she wrote a rejection letter to Matthew Henry and forced her brother to deliver it to Matthew at Jacobsburg. Joseph didn't want to. "I feel sick," he wrote, "when I think of handing it to that excellent man." And then, quite presumptuously, he told his sister, "Now, Esther, I know very well you will marry him." Joseph promised to eat his hat if she did not marry Matthew. Here's what he wrote. "Esther, do not expose me to the disagreeable necessity of devouring my new nice silk hat. For you know I have declared myself ready to swallow it after proper chewing in case you remain determined to treat that excellent man in so summary a manner." But despite this pressure from her brother, his urging and mocking, Esther stuck to her guns and in a few days sent Matthew a letter. This is her rejection letter, addressed to him at Catherine Furness, named after the wife who'd passed away. Esther wrote, "Happy as I feel in the possession of your esteem, and sincerely as it is reciprocated on my part, I cannot conscientiously accept of your offer. I am fully conscious of my inability to undertake a charge so responsible as that of a numerous family, destitute as I am of any qualifications requisite for such an undertaking. We don't know how Matthew responded to this rejection, but within a few days the two were engaged. Again, Joseph's letters to his sister provide the only information that we have. Just a few days after Esther sent her rejection letter, Joseph let Esther know that he heard from Matthew, from Mr. Henry, that he had an interview with you in the course of which he succeeded in dissipating all your fear as to your inability to manage the concerns of so large an establishment, and that you had consented to become Mrs. Henry. When Esther didn't elaborate on how exactly Matthew had changed her mind, Joseph wrote again. "I might have expected," he wrote, "that you would give me a detailed account of all the arguments of which Mr. Henry made use. Give me a detailed account of all the arguments of which Mr. Henry made use. Now, upon my word, he must be a cogent and powerful reasoner. In 2 minutes, did you say, or was it 2.5, that he dissipated your formidable array of objections and absolute refusals?" In any case, Matthew Henry and Esther Berg were married about a month and a half later. So she became Matthew Henry's second wife. Now, collections of documents, such as the ones I just read from, which are at the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem, are very exciting, but they're also very frustrating. On the one hand, as in that example, they illuminate in very surprising detail people's intimate lives, or intimate moments of people's lives, but they're frustrating because they leave other things entirely in the dark. And one thing they leave in the dark, and one thing we still don't know, is why, within a year of this second marriage, Matthew Henry sold all his interest in the Jacobsburg operations and began, with Esther and their large family, which continued to grow, as I mentioned, a life of frequent movement and frequent money troubles and frequent lawsuits, all of which sadly alienated him from his family and even alienated Esther from his brother. You can tell from those letters they had a very close relationship before. Matthew and Esther Henry's financial woes became so severe, and contrary to Joseph Berg's expectation, Matthew Henry did not prosper. His decision to sell those diverse operations up at Jacobsburg, the forge and the furnace and other things, shortly after his marriage, may have stemmed from the preferences of his new wife. But it's much more likely that they stemmed from financial necessity. Since Matthew had begun, even in the 1820s, a series of ruinous and increasingly desperate financial transactions, and it'll take a lot more work to understand these transactions in full, but basically, Matthew Henry took out loans, and family members, both his brothers and his cousins, co-signed for those loans, and Matthew Henry couldn't pay the loans, and these relatives found themselves burdened by them. Perhaps it's familiar from some of our own personal circumstances. But by December 1833, for instance, a loan came in for $1,500 that Matthew Henry couldn't pay, and it was just one of many. So it seems like there were real financial difficulties that burdened family members, other family members. And the consequences of these financial transactions were complicated and worsened by the family's ongoing attempts to sort out the estate of an uncle who had died in Detroit, very wealthy, but without a will. And I think in desperation to solve his financial troubles at Jacobsburg, Matthew Henry took the lead in these efforts. He thought there would be a real payoff from this estate. And he didn't deal fairly with his siblings and with the other beneficiaries. One of them, a Moravian minister named Andrew Benaid, wrote in July 1834, so less than a year later, "Poor Matt, it is certainly not a good spirit by which he seems to be governed at present. His conduct, which by the peace and harmony of the families are disturbed, seems so very strange and unaccountable that I do not know what to think of him." And by 1835, his brother Joseph, just downstream, or at Bolton, sarcastically called Matthew a wonderful man who, after writing such an insulting letter, invited me the next day to a meeting to settle differences. And Joseph decided not to answer any more of his letters. So the result of this whole mess was that by the mid-1830s, Matthew Henry was alienated from his large family of siblings. And this alienation would last until his death 30 years later. Now, he accomplished a lot later in life. He produced that superb map of Northampton County. We have an original at Jacobsburg in the Long Rifle Museum. And he wrote a very important history of Northampton County on the lower right there, that was published in 1860. And he left several other manuscripts, including a history of the Delaware language and a long history of Northampton County, which were unpublished at his death. They're down at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. But he became the black sheep of the family, partly because of what others thought were selfish financial dealings, but also because he began to sell off family heirlooms. He was so impoverished that he possessed. One member of the family wrote, "Uncle Matt ransacked and sold all the family papers and the Bibles too." But for our story today, what's important is that Matthew Henry's financial crisis expels the Henrys from Jacobsburg, Presumably in the 1820s, as I mentioned, when he began to raise a family there and built Catherine Furnace, Matthew Henry thought he would remain at that place, as his descendants did downstream, for the rest of his career, just as it happened with his brother. But things turned out differently at Jacobsburg. So Matthew's nephew, a boy named William Wally, this is Sabina Henry, who ran the shop. This is her son, Sabina Henry Wally, their eldest son. He first proposed purchasing Matthew Henry's Jacobsburg properties in late 1832. He assured his father, wrongly, as it turns out, that these properties would enable him to clear $1,000 a year. Perhaps his uncle Matthew misled him about the promise of the operations at Jacobsburg. But with a partner, Peter Kern, another Nazareth man, William Wally bought the properties in 1833, and he continued to supply the 10-plate stoves that Catherine Furnace was known for. But within a year, he and Kern transferred his operations to other relatives, two Walleys and an Albright, and their firm became known as Walleys and Albright. And I mention it only because that's the name. You can't really see it there, but that's the name on the Catherine Furnace 10-plate stove that's at Jacobsburg in the Pennsylvania Long Rifle Museum. So the firm of Walleys and Albright owns these Jacobsburg properties in the late 1830s, but they lost Catherine Furnace in 1840. And at the Moravian Archives is preserved a big broadside where they're putting not the property, but all the other materials that the firm had owned up for sale, including lathes and wagons and stove patterns and 29 stoves. So by the early 1840s, a series of continued defaults on loans and payments due, led all of the properties in the Jacobsburg tract to pass into the hands of the sheriff, who in turn arranged its sale to other interested parties. A man named Joseph Cope owned most of the north part of the tract in the 1840s, including the sort of village that Matthew Henry had built where the furnace had been. Well, Andrew Benaid, that brother-in-law I mentioned before, the relative and Moravian minister, he came into possession of a lot of the land around Henry's Forge, closer to where the environmental center is today, because he inherited it, or he got it because he loaned money to Matthew Henry. And all of this land was sold off or had it taken away because of defaults by the sheriffs by 1853. By mid-century, there were no Henrys any longer, or Henry relatives operating land or conducting any industrial operations at Jacobsburg. In 1844, a history of Northampton County described Jacobsburg as a village with a post office on the Nazareth-Wind Gap Road, which in addition to 8 dwellings had a store, a tavern, a gristmill, and a furnace, which in 1844, the author said, was still in successful operation. So that furnace that Matthew Henry had built in 1824 was still operating in 1844 for 20 years. But sometime soon after that, operations ceased entirely at Catherine Furnace. A tannery, as I mentioned before, was built at Jacobsburg on top of or very nearby the site of the furnace. And the tannery was there by 1848. We know because its owner broke his leg there at a tannery in Jacobsburg, the report said. In 1851, Matthew Henry himself, financially ruined, though only about 60, in pretty poor health, wrote a history of Northampton County, as I mentioned, still not published, and also produced that map, both of which identified the tannery, but no longer mentioned the furnace at Jacobsburg. That's from Matthew Henry's map. Here's how he described the village that he had built 25 years before, but which he'd abandoned. Jacobsburg is a post town, he wrote, with Mr. Thomas Gold as postmaster. Gold had bought the tavern and store in 1831. Matthew Henry continued that the village contained a tavern, a store, a gristmill and sawmill, a tannery, and a forge. All the things we've seen before. There were a number of other dwelling houses, which probably housed the workers for those various industries. And other land transfer documents from this time mention the other structures on the site, including a large two-story stone house. That would have been Matthew Henry's house that I showed you before, a stone office, a coal house. I showed you that in that imaginative reconstruction, and a long track that would have delivered the charcoal to the furnace, which was no longer there. And all late 19th century maps, this is one from 1874, they include the same properties, a hotel, some mills, grist mills, and a tannery. And the fact that different maps identify different names associated with each of the properties suggests the speed with which ownership turned over. Over the course of the 19th century, the hotel itself, the first thing on the track, seems to have become a sort of rowdy place. In 1880, when the wife of the proprietor of the hotel refused to sell a man liquor, he insulted her, and her 10-year-old son shot the man through the chest with a revolver. And the subsequent history of the area can be sketched pretty quickly. By the turn of the century, around 1900, Frank Christ, who was a very interesting man, seems to have acquired most of the Jacobsburg tract, including the parcel on which the hotel sat. He inherited that. In 1901, he sold 300 acres at Jacobsburg to a lumber company from Penargil called Fitzgerald Spear and Company. And this sale mentioned just that tiny little notice in a local paper. A few years later, the Blue Mountain Consolidated Water Company obtained this land from Fitzgerald Spear. It turns out Nazareth and Easton had been experiencing terrible water supply problems around 1900. In 1908, the local newspaper reported that Nazareth suffered the greatest water famine in its history. Because Blue Mountain Consolidated Water was unable to obtain sufficient water from properties up in Monroe County, which they were using to supply patrons in Nazareth. So this water company purchased the Jacobsburg lands in the hope of alleviating this water supply problem in Nazareth. That company later merged with the Southeastern Water Company, which sold all the land to the city of Easton in 1936. The city purchased a 500-acre tract at Jacobsburg for which it paid $22,000. And a newspaper noted that it was purchased as a supplemental water source, but was never used as one. Easton planned to build a reservoir on the tract, but engineers who investigated it found that it would be useless for that purpose. In 1956, the city of Easton announced that it would sell the tract, it called it a 526-acre tract, to a purchaser for private development. But the citizens of Easton made it clear that they preferred the city of Easton to sell the tract to the state for a park, even if it meant a financial loss. They wanted it to go to the state rather than to a developer. The state's plans for the park, even before they purchased it, involved damming the Bushkill Creek to create a swimming and a fishing lake. And the state did purchase the land in December 1959 for about $59,000. And it continued to acquire adjacent parcels around there, including land from the Henrys, where Bolton had stood, and the land on which the Henry homestead stands. The archaeological work that I've shown you a few pictures of that Virginia and Joseph Lopresti undertook was done with great urgency, because at that time it was feared that these historical sites might be, as Charles Sandwick wrote, under a 94-acre lake, which was then included in the plans for Jacobsburg State Park. And some of you probably know, Joe and Bobby certainly do, the rest of the story. The state's plan to create that swimming and fishing lake was countered by a variety of organizations, including the newly formed Jacobsburg Historical Society, and these efforts saved what we now call Henry's Woods, including the site where the village of Jacobsburg had stood. Sadly, the foundations that the Loprestis painstakingly excavated and documented have been reclaimed again by nature, as I mentioned. The state, which owns that land now, has determined that the cost of maintaining these sites, even as ruins, was prohibitive. Even to produce signage for those sites would draw the public, hikers, to what's a dangerous hillside. And so these sites at the old village of Jacobsburg are now as invisible to visitors to the state park as they were before the Loprestis undertook their research. So this 19th century industrial community at Jacobsburg, the gun factory, a mill, a smithy, a forge, a furnace, well, not the furnace, was first built by William Henry of Nazareth and then purchased and enlarged by his son Matthew Henry, who constructed the furnace, which he called Catherine Furnace after his wife. This cluster of industries built into that hillside seemed to have great promise. In those letters I read to you from 1833, Joseph Berg was sure that Matthew Henry would prosper. But it was not to be. The man who built up Jacobsburg, Matthew Henry, also lost Jacobsburg, which never recovered or flourished after he left. Even the hotel was in ruins by 1910. Thanks to the archaeological work 45 years ago